welcome to the linguistic implications of materialism. This is a project that will focus on getting linguistic information from the stone tools made by our ancient ancestors. The ancestors in question are Australopithecus and Homo erectus. Those will be the two that we'll be focusing on. The presentation is by me, by the way. Now let's start with some observations, okay? I've noticed that in linguistics there's a huge bias against our ancient ancestors. There's an influx of resources about sapiens, Neanderthals even, but just not the aforementioned ancestors that we'll be discussing. Even in this class, we only briefly explored how Stone Age technology affected our cognition, but even then we neglected to connect technology to language directly, which of course is the focus of this presentation. And while the distribution and evolution of tool culture is crucial to anthropology, it is rarely asked how hominids were encouraged to use these new tools. Now you see, did a little Australopithecus just see a tool dropped by some other hominid and he picked it up and he was like, I bet you I can make this? Or do you think he was taught it? Teacher and student, do you think he was taught it on a conversational level? That's one of the questions we'll be asking. There also seems to be an idea that language is too complex for our small-brained ancestors. Well, I can't directly refute it. I do hope it turns out to be false. I think they're a lot more complex than most people realize. And just to show you how dramatically tool culture is spread, this is a map of the Acheulean hand axe, a tool that we'll be discussing later on. This is its range. It got far, right? It was a widely used tool, and, we're going to figure out why. So this is going to be the core of our presentation, our hypothesis. We're going to prove that by mapping the dispersal of sequential tool cultures and the hominins that made them, we can infer their linguistic capabilities based on how they use the tools and how far they spread them. Now let's take a look at this diagram here. This chart outlines the basic process of tool dispersal and replacement throughout the Paleolithic, okay? So the two main tools we'll be discussing are the Oldowan style tools and the Acheulean hand axes. So the Oldowan style tools, they originated to solve a problem. The tool dispersed because it did solve the problem. But then the people who couldn't use the tool, the tool itself became a pressure because, the other ones, they were out competing him. We'll explore this further. But what we will actually be focusing on is the role that language and communication had in this process. Exploring each dispersal chronologically, diving into these dispersals will give us insight into the linguistic capabilities of the hominins that took part in them. As we move through the project, we will be attempting to answer these following questions. How could the process of creating complex stone tools be communicated to unaware populations? This is kind of what I was discussing earlier. What were they taught it? That's one of the things I've been curious about. And can we infer how hominids communicated based on how they used their tools cooperatively? What we'll be focusing on here is mainly hunting tactics. Cooperative hunting was a very large development. We'll be exploring what their tools can tell us about that. Uh, does the extinction of more archaic hominins coincide with the advent of new technology? We're going to see just how big of a role the tools had in the extinction of earlier hominins and what limited them. Why couldn't they use the tools? Now let's explore the origin of tool making. Okay, so Oldowan style tools are the first truly complex tool human used, and as you can see down here, it's not all that complex, but it's certainly more complex than just a rock thrown another rock. Recent scholarship has shown evidence of their use from 3.3 to 1.7 million years ago. This time frame suggests that their inventor had to have been an Australopithecus species. I think specifically it would have had to have been Australopithecus afarensis because they were the ones that were in the Rift Valley, which is where this is found. As I was just getting to, the oldest tools were found in the Rift Valley of Kenya and Ethiopia. The Rift Valley is basically, the tectonic plate of Africa. It's splitting apart, and that rift is forming. You get the picture. And that's their place of origin, which, as I mentioned, coincides with the Australopithecus range. So the dispersal of these tools is interesting, because Oldowan-style tools didn't stay confined to the Rift Valley. Instead, they spread across the rest of Africa and Eurasia. And these dispersals, they happen in waves, only beginning with early members of the genus Homo, such as Homo erectus, we've talked about him a bit. He crossed into Eurasia. Now these hominins had a greatly increased skull size. Homo erectus had a skull size of around 800 to 900 cc's, cubic centimeters, compared to the 400 to 550 cc's of Australopithecus, which Lewis Harmon notes had only modestly surpassed what is observed in the extant great apes. Extant means still alive, so think chimpanzees, gorillas. This increased brain size likely gave them the capacity to communicate and cooperate with other non-related individuals, which, as we'll look at later, is crucial. Australopithecus communication, it wouldn't have been vocal. They still had air sacs, which inhibit the ability to make complex and precise sounds. So they wouldn't have been able to have a conversation like we are right now. They would have likely relied on gesturing, especially to communicate the process of tool creation. It was likely that it was kind of that teacher-student scenario we were talking about, and it would have had to be, you know, kind of gestured because they couldn't talk. But we're going to figure this out ourselves. That's what we're going to be doing. So the old one style tools, they are simple. They're so simple, in fact, that we can make them ourselves. The steps that we're going to be taking is this video tutorial right here. It's a great video. It's only about a minute long, and we're going to be walking through this. So to accurately represent the learning experience of our ancestors, follow these steps. Grab 2 rocks from outdoors, one hard one, as in like a hammerstone, and one flaky one. You can kind of just look at it and figure that out. We're going to play the video on mute, and they couldn't speak. They had to gesture. So playing it on mute will kind of give the idea of gestural education. And we're going to see if we can understand the process of making an Oldowan style tool. Now I'll let you guys do this on your own, but what I was able to do was make this stone right here. It was difficult. I had to hammer off a couple flakes, but I just couldn't get it right. The edge was very sharp though. And I personally do believe, I mean, I was able to understand it pretty well, so I do think it would have been possible to communicate this process through gestures. Now let's move on to some of the fun stuff. This is what's known as an Acheulean hand axe. They're one of the most widely used tools in human history, and we use them for a long time. Uh, if you thought making that old one style tool was hard, you need to give up because these things are complex. They were the successor to Oldowan style tools, being invented by the Homo erectus, actually in the same place as the Oldowan style tools. And they were used from 1.7 million years ago to 300,000 years ago. They were replaced pretty recently. And like I said, that makes them the longest used tool in human history. As you can see to the example above this, these hand axes changed a lot throughout their use time. This is one of the earliest known examples right here, and it originated in the Rift Valley in Kenya, like I mentioned. The examples to the right of me is a collection of later, much more complex hand axes collected from a number of sites. These are most likely European. Um, uh, Homo erectus did go up to Eurasia, like I mentioned, and in Europe they seem to have kind of a renaissance of just using weird stones, which I assume that's what the collection is. They were also the first human to utilize fire, which I figured was worth mentioning. Alright, now let's dive deep. As I alluded to on the last slide, these hand axes were far more complex than anything made before them. The old one style tools could have reasonably been explained through gesturing, but these hand axes certainly could not have been. To get a usable hand axe, a minimum of 20 strikes is needed, with some later ones needing up to 60. Homo erectus revolutionized not just tool culture, but hunting culture as well. This is kind of the cooperation that I alluded to earlier. They were the first hominin to practice endurance hunting, which is a really complex process in which humans follow an animal until it collapses from exhaustion. Our ability to dissipate heat through sweat originated in them. That's why humans are such good runners. We can run because our sweat cools us off. That's also why people don't live in jungles. We were looking at the dispersal map, and there wasn't many people in the Congo. That's because if it gets above 100% humidity, your sweat can't dissipate. You get too hot. Anyhow, the group hunting practices they displayed required a large amount of cooperation and communication to use effectively. They by no means had a full-fledged spoken language, as their larynx was still not descended to the same level it is in modern humans, giving them a smaller sound repertoire. Your larynx, by the way, is a detached bone in your throat. It allows you to control your voice box. Basically, that's kind of what it is. It's what your Adam apple is. Uh, So planning a hunting trip would have required the ability to reference objects not immediately present, designating the roles, the targets, the tools, the routes, etc. So this is what's known as displaced reference, and it's kind of just the ability to reference things that aren't present. It doesn't sound that crazy, but it was revolutionary. The fact that I can talk about, you guys through the screen, even though I can't see you, that's a example of displaced reference. Um, the same thing it wasn't just for hunting, gathering did it as well. I mean, You have to know what you're looking for, why you're looking for it, why you need it, what does it look like? Those are all important if you're gathering. All these questions would have required at least some capacity for communication and certainly the ability to reference objects not present. The map in the top left corner of the page shows the dispersal route of Homo erectus overlaid on a modern map. It must be noted, however, that the world map would have looked significantly different at the time they were dispersing. I mean, there was wide climate events going on. I mean, the Ice Age hadn't even happened for some reference, so it would have looked different, but this is a good idea. Now we're going to be looking at some of the fun stuff. So, roughly 2 million years ago, Australopithecus, the inventor of the Oldowan-style tools, went extinct. They were a scavenger. Their lifestyle revolved around stealing the carcasses from other animals, and that's why they developed tools in the first place. They needed to break open the bones to get the bone marrow out, just to get that extra calorie boost. Um, you know, but being a scavenger, they were quickly competed by Homo erectus, who were actual hunters. I mean, you can get way more nutrients from a full elephant than just a couple bones. So they didn't live long enough to even see hand axes, but even if they had, it's more than likely they couldn't have made use of them. When discussing Australopithecus' ability to create tools, Harmon describes them as nappers who could have been less capable of foreseeing where or how to remove a flake. What that means is that they probably would have been worse at visualizing, what they want their tool to look like, what they want the blade to look like. Which, I mean, as we mentioned previously, it took like 60 strikes to make a hand axe. You couldn't do that. And their abrupt extinction was no doubt aided in their lack of communication skills. So later hominins, they went extinct slowly by continuously integrating more and more into other human groups before eventually disappearing altogether. Humans, interestingly, we can actually interbreed with other species, like Neanderthals especially we did. But Australopithecus, they didn't get that chance because they were incapable of nearly everything Homo erectus did. They couldn't have integrated in the group. They couldn't have hunted. They realistically couldn't have gathered or communicated, so they would have just been useless. They were too top-heavy to run effectively. They were too dumb to speak. No, that's a negative term, but that's kind of the term to use. And frankly, they were just too different to reproduce with. Um, but now, we have to explore why Homo erectus went extinct. It's much different than Australopithecus. Homo erectus kicked the bucket only around 100,000 years ago, which is honestly quite a bit more recent than I expected, as I mentioned in my text. Uh, there is quite a lot of controversy around this figure, as many can't decide whether they should be divided up into separate groups over their 1.9 million year existence. So, as I mentioned, they dispersed. Well, actually, here, let me pull up the map. They dispersed from Africa into Eurasia. But not all of them did, as we can see by this arrow here. Some of them stayed in Africa, moving south or east. And, this is where the controversy happens. I mean, after millions of years of being separate, they were vastly different. For reference, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, their last common ancestor was around 400,000 years ago. So they were pretty different, which is why I personally support the theory that the populations living in Africa and Eurasia were separate. But anyhow, sorry. The ones that stayed in Africa have kind of been designated Homo ergaster, and the ones that moved into Eurasia, those are the ones that have been designated Homo erectus, kind of in the modern scholarship. Um, I personally think that they should be separate as they had very dramatic differences. Like the ones that stayed in Africa, they were more robust. They had a smaller brain size compared to the ones in Eurasia, which were pretty complex. Um, Yeah, especially later on for sure. Either way, they both died off during the beginning of the last glacial maximum due to their adaptation for warmer, more humid climates. It's funny, they outcompeted Australopithecus because they were more adaptable, but then also died because they were not adaptable. Now, okay, let's take a look at our chart. Looking at this chart with our new knowledge about Acheulean hand axes paints a grisly picture. Australopithecus was doomed. Not just because of its inability to make hand axes, but because it didn't have the ability to adapt. It lacked collective reasoning, meaning it wasn't able to come up with solutions to the competition. It was unable to move over long distances, because they were super top heavy. And they weren't able to feasibly absorb the knowledge to learn the new complex tools. So it was outcompeted. Um, so we've looked at tool culture through a linguistic lens, applying not just our linguistic knowledge, but also our human reasoning. It's important to remember that these are humans too. As far off as they are, they had the same thoughts and feelings as we did. except for Australopithecus, because they probably didn't. They were kind of stupid. Anyhow, we questioned how our ancestors communicated as groups, asking if there was any way they could have achieved what they did without speaking. Our examination showed that from the start of our tool-making journey, communication, as simple as it may have been, was a must. We later examined whether Homo erectus's lifestyle would have been possible without language, concluding that it couldn't have as well. Our hypothesis was proven correct. We were successfully able to support which hominins use language by examining the spread and dispersal of their distinct tool cultures. Now, if you've enjoyed this presentation, I really do encourage you to explore other aspects, such as maybe cloth. Maybe cloth. I've never even looked at that at all. Maybe the bones. What can the arm structure of Homo erectus tell us about its lifestyle? What can we learn about Denisovans or Neanderthals? This structure of examination is underutilized and ripe with opportunity. That's my works cited. I really do thank you for joining me. I will see you next time.